Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we are rejoined by your favorite guest, me, myself, and I. Yes, there are no special guests today. It's just me talking into a microphone for nearly an hour, which I know you guys all love and enjoy. So we've got a lot to talk about today. I mean, there's a lot of breaking news going on in the country right now, even though they think the biggest topic right now is how the totalitarian GOP is cracking down on brave dissidents like Liz Cheney. So today, the brave and bold and heroic Liz Cheney lost her leadership position as the leader of the Republican House Conference. This is to be expected, but for the past few weeks, the media has been trying to say like, "Oh, this is cancel culture. How could Republicans dare do something this to someone who's simply telling the truth?" And what Liz Cheney, of course, was doing was constantly obsessed with Trump and like saying we have to defeat the big lie and conspiracy theories, and how dare anyone challenge our democracy. And this is coming from somebody from a family who lied to the American public to get us into the Iraq War, who subverted many of our constitutional norms to justify the war on terror, were able to find their legal wiggle room to start torturing suspects suspected of terrorism. Yeah, this is the Cheney family. This is such a joke that the great constitutional defender is the daughter of Dick Cheney. But that's the world we live in, and none of these people really actually care about her past or warmongering. I mean, they support it. They support foreign interventions, and she's a part of the team no matter what they say. But anyway, but according to the media, the job of the House Conference Chair for the Republican Party is to belittle its members, to alienate voters, and to attack its still undisputed leader, the person that the ordinary party voters and lawmakers rally behind and see as their main guy. And apparently, according to the media, the job is not to organize and unite the Republicans behind common policies or common efforts to get things done in Congress. It's to go on the media and talk about how evil and anti-democratic Trump is, and how his supporters are evil racists, and how they deserve to, we need to deploy the national security state that her father helped build and be used against them. This is apparently the job of the House Conference Chair. Of course, to ordinary Republicans, that's not the job. It's to actually, unite the caucus, promote common talking points, and it's basically be a political hack. I mean, your job is to be the partisan, to be out there arguing for your own side and making sure your own side is united. And this person, Liz Cheney, decided that it made more sense for her to get, plaudits from CNN and New York Times and the Washington Post instead of doing her job. And that's why she was removed. I mean, it's not simply a fact of, we just can't tolerate people who attack our dear leader, Trump. I mean, you have to look back is that when, there was a vote on her in early February, and Kevin McCarthy, and they had the time to get rid of her, and this would have been much better if they had, but House leadership stood by her on the assumption that she would stop talking about Trump, she would move on and unite the caucus, and people are like, oh, she brings in so much money, she's good with the donors, of course we'll let her stay. Obviously, they learned their lesson over the last 3 months, and they've decided that it's too much to keep her around. But, they should have had they had a good opportunity in February where it would have been less chaotic and, less of a headache, but they chose not to. Maybe it was because the people who were leading it were Matt Gaetz and other fire-breathing Trump supporters, but, it is what it is. So there are a lot of takeaways from what happened to Liz Cheney. I mean, the obvious one is that it's Trump's party. I mean, you cannot be a leader in the party if you're anti-Trump. I mean, you compare, Liz Cheney with Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell basically said that he wanted all Trump completely removed from the party. He would never support him again. He would never talk to him again after January 6th. What does he do now? He has not said anything about Trump. And even when Trump attacks him, he refuses to say anything because he knows that agitates his own senators and his own voters. And he's like, okay, I'm just going to move on. Like, that's something that Liz Cheney couldn't do. And the party acts on what Trump wants. If, Trump is, attacking somebody, it makes it very hard for that person to survive in the party. And we're going to see this play out in the 2022 primaries. I mean, will people like, Lisa Murkowski stay alive? Will these horrible congressmen like Adam Kinzinger and and the Representative Meyer from Michigan and all these other, and will even Liz Cheney keep their seats going into 2022? We're probably going to see a lot of these people lose their seats because of their stance on Trump and the fact that Trump still holds the loyalty of roughly 90% of the party. There was a comment made by the horrible Arkansas governor, Asa Hutchinson, the guy who defended chemical castration for kids. He was over there saying like, well, we can't have Trump we can't unite with Trump because he's dividing our party. And it's like, 90% of your party's behind him. Like, there's nobody else with that level of support. And you're just saying, well, he divides us. So we're going to instead go with Liz Cheney, who clearly divides the party, but apparently we need to ignore those divisions and just unite around her and her mission to restore George W. Bushism to the centerpiece, to the defining ideology of the party, which nobody really wants. And when Liz Cheney was giving her self-righteous speech to the caucus, today to defend, well, she wasn't even defending her position. She's like, I don't want to be a leader of a party that doesn't stand with the Constitution, et cetera, or will threaten our democracy, all these stupid things that what she was saying. The party booed her, and no one defended her in the caucus, too. They went straight to a voice vote. This is how unpopular she is. This is how nobody wants what she's selling. They want Trumpism. But there is a downside to this. There is a downside to making, the Trump the centerpiece of the party. Even though, as you guys know, I've always defended Trump, or usually tried to defend Trump. And I always say that when you look at all the other leaders that are central figures that the GOP could have and the American right could have, Trump is still the best option, despite his many faults. That could change. I will grant that. But for right now, he is the best option. And one of the downsides we're seeing is that there's a cult of personality around him that, in some ways the cult of personality is good. We're not necessarily criticizing cult of personalities when used for good. But around this is that he only cares about personal loyalty rather than loyalty to an actual agenda item, to national populism, to Trumpism as a political ideology. And we can see this with who he endorsed to replace Liz Cheney. It's Elise Stefanik. Stefanik is terrible. She's more liberal than Liz Cheney on pretty much every issue. She's a neocon. She's a huge immigration booster. She just recently co-sponsored an amnesty in the House. There's this horrible Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which would legalize millions of illegal alien farm laborers, turn them into indentured servants, and then for like 4 or 5 years, and then they would eventually be able to get a green card. So it's amnesty through indentured servitude, and it's a terrible idea. It undermines American workers. It forces us to have millions of people here and their families, so it's going to completely change our country. And she supports it because it helps big ag, it helps corporate interest. This is not somebody who gets American workers. And she's even had stomp comments like, oh, I'm standing up for the American workers. It's like literally nothing that she does stands up for the American workers. And prior to her becoming a huge Trump defender, which happened during Trump's first impeachment trial in 2019 when she became a huge celebrity on Fox News, she was criticizing the wall. She was criticizing all the restrictions. She also criticized the travel ban. In 2016, she was saying the Muslim ban is not who we are. We are also not the wall. The wall and border security, that's just unrealistic. And despite her all the records, she's been a liberal on other issues. But I mean, the real things we care about is foreign policy and and immigration. When it comes to that, I guess the rest, she's also pretty liberal on that because the House Freedom Caucus and others think that she's a liberal and she's not conservative enough to lead the conference. And just based on her immigration record alone, that's true. She does not have the credentials to lead the party. But I will say this, even though despite her downside, she would still be an improvement over Liz Cheney. I think she is smart enough to realize that she is not going to push for amnesty and these liberal immigration bills if she wants to retain the conference chair. This is an unruly caucus that has the potential to unseat their own leaders. And leadership will follow behind it. And there's Fox News that they have to deal with, that people will rip them apart if they will go too far on certain issues. As Kevin McCarthy is learning with Tucker's frequent attacks on him now, and, in his cozy relationship with Frank Luntz. So this is what's happening in the caucus. I don't think she's going to make the caucus, whip up votes for an amnesty. I think she'll, simply vote. She'll probably still have some terrible votes. I think she'll change on the matter of illegal immigration. And she seems to be, one of the things that she does seem to be changing is, immigration law enforcement. I think she would probably support the wall now and stuff. I mean, this is minor stuff. I mean, it should be like a given that if you're a Republican, you support border security and are opposed to illegal immigration. And I don't think she's going to support the type of amnesty that Biden wants to push through Congress. Yeah, I mean, clearly she's not a real improvement, but it's still good that Liz Cheney is gone, because that does send the signal, the message that the party of George W. Bush is dead. And even though Liz Stefanik, on policy wise, is allied with the George W. Bush party, from an aesthetic and style and, on the surface, it is a Trump party, and people aren't going to really care about her policies. Like, no matter what no matter what her votes are, she's still associated with the Trump wing. And that does, signal support for America First candidates, that this is your party and we are going to take over, and we're not going to allow people who are warmongering corporate elitists like Liz Cheney run the party anymore. And even in Trump's statements on Cheney, he hit her on immigration, foreign policy, and many other issues that we care about. Of course, Elise Stefanik, they bring out like the Border Patrol union endorsing her. That's basically it. I mean, it's not ideal. I think if they wanted somebody, they would get somebody like Jim Banks, who's the head of the Republican Study Committee. He's very good on immigration, very good on all our issues that we care about. He gets it that, the Republican Party has to be turned into a national populist vehicle. It can't just simply be a cult of personality that says nice things about Trump, but still governs and still pushes the same policies as George W. Bush and the Tea Party and Paul Ryan. It has to move forward. And he gets that. Elise Stefanik doesn't get that. And certainly Liz Cheney doesn't get that. But ultimately, I think some people got so angry about Elise Stefanik, which I don't like Elise Stefanik at all, and I don't think it's a real victory, a huge victory to replace Liz Cheney with her. I wouldn't go so far as to say that, the ouster of Liz Cheney is still not a victory. It is hitting back at these old sources of power within the GOP and showing that everything has to be loyal to Trump. And while there still will be maybe one or two people like Elise Stefanik in that, most of the people who are going to be in the Trump wing are going to identify with national populism and Trumpism and know that they cannot go to the left on immigration and foreign policy and trade and political correctness, et cetera, et cetera. They have to stand with the Trump agenda that he ran and won on in 2016. And they get that. And some of them will try to find some wiggle room, but I think most of them will get the message and will not be like Elise Stefanik. So on that side, it's still good news, but it does come with some caveats. That's what's happening on the Republican side. Now what's happening on the other side with Liz Cheney is pretty hilarious. I think that, if you went back just even 5 years ago, and certainly 10 or 15 years ago, and if you told liberals that they would be eagerly defending the Cheney family and their grip on power over the GOP, they would have thought you nuts. But this is what we have now. And it's not just like these like mainstream liberals on like centrist types on CNN or MS or whatever. It's Bernie Sanders who's defending Liz Cheney. He had a tweet. He had two tweets in defense of her, saying I stand with Liz Cheney, and the real important thing is not policy; it's defending our democracy. Which there is no defense of democracy by saying you stand with Liz Cheney. I mean, the whole authority structure is on Liz Cheney's side. I mean, there is no fear that we're going to lose our liberties and democracy because Liz Cheney loses her leadership position. And, this is a huge pet peeve of mine, but they continue to do this. Every liberal and all of her conservative supporters continue to say, Liz Cheney is a victim of cancel culture. And every single person who says this defends ordinary Americans losing their jobs for having an offensive political stance, or supporting Trump, or saying things that certain protected class of Americans, such as Magic Americans, are offended by, and they lose their jobs. None of these people say anything when, like, last summer there was countless numbers of people who lost their jobs, who were kicked out of school because they criticized Black Lives Matter. Apparently that's accountability culture. But Liz Cheney, who is a powerful politician coming from one of the most powerful families in our country, is a millionaire, has tons of money, never has to worry about actually getting canceled of anything or any real negative consequences to her livelihood. She is a victim of cancel culture because apparently if you want to respect free speech, you have to have your leaders completely shit on your own base, your own supporters, and divide your party and make you a weak, inept party in order to, uphold this ridiculous notion of free speech that liberals foist on us, when at the same time they believe that hate speech and, speech questioning the election should be totally censored and punished by jail time. So these people, it's not serious at all. And the same people are saying this love the fact that people with clean records who had never committed a crime before, whose only crime was illegally entering the Capitol without permission, are suffering in jail, who are indefinitely detained, who have their bail revoked because of their political speech. That is the real cancel culture. It is not this stupidity, inane, arguments saying that a party deciding that, we don't want Liz Cheney as our leader, who is this powerful, wealthy figure who is not some ordinary American who's getting canceled. That is not cancel culture, but they always bring out these inane talking points. It's the same time, there's this particular liberal attribute where they take words that are associated with the right, such as cancel culture, such as snowflake, such as safe space, and they direct it in a way that is utterly maddening because it completely destroys the point of that talking point. It's like saying, oh, you don't like being arrested and having your bail revoked and are having no bail. You must be a little snowflake. Do you need your safe space and solitary confinement? There's these are the type of talking points they make. And with Liz Cheney now, they're just apparently cancel culture is having a problem with, and they'll use this even with people are saying I don't like this newspaper. Well, that's cancel culture to criticize the Washington Post. I thought you guys didn't like cancel culture. It's a way of undermining their talking points and making, legitimate complaints completely silly and ridiculous because of the standard that's upheld or spread in the media. And conservatives are responsible for this by, previously saying that cancel culture is lame criticism of mainstream politicians. That's not cancel culture. It is ordinary Americans who fear saying anything in public, are expressing their political opinion because they know they'll lose their job, they'll lose their income, they'll lose their house, they'll lose their family, etc., because of their political opinions. That's cancel culture, not what happens to powerful political figures like Liz Cheney. With that in mind, moving on to how the left is treating Liz Cheney. But, going off of what Bernie Sanders was saying, the new standard is, he was right. It's not about policy differences. It's about your ability to side with, even though he says it's democracy, the real term is globalist American empire. Whether you will accept the elite mainstream consensus on everything. We can have differences over, whether we should nuke Iran or taxes or regulations and even abortion. They'll allow that as the one social issue to be discussed. but on the issues of immigration, on the necessity of this deep state, on the ability of the left to steal elections, on and to ensure that they get the right election results. There is no debate allowed there. And especially with there's no debate allowed over whether America should, be a multicultural state. It has to be a multicultural state. You have to embrace diversity. There's no debate over that allowed. So with Liz Cheney, she supports the consensus on all these issues, and she can have, the differences that the few differences that are tolerated, she'll take those up. But she's no threat to the system. And it's the same with Bernie Sanders. I mean, he is absolutely no threat to the system, even though they rigged 2 elections against him. They did this, and he's such a bitch that he just accepts it and goes along with the people who ensured that he would have never been president and relegated his side to political to losing, that they relegated them to irrelevance within the Democratic Party. His side is not in the driver's seat. It's the liberals who rigged the elections against him. But they're all just on one big happy side. Bernie Sanders, DSA types, Liz Cheney, Chuck Schumer, MSNBC, CNN, they're all on the same side fighting against authoritarianism, because apparently the party that is not the majority in either the House, the Senate, or has control over the White House, or any control over corporations, the military, the deep state, really only a minor influence over the judiciary, and has zero influence over our culture, is apparently on the verge of destroying our democracy and imposing an authoritarian regime upon us. There was some woman, I forget her name, but I commented on her post. She was saying that this is once again a sign of totalitarianism. And this woman has a law degree from UC Berkeley. She probably points that out in her bio, even though she's like in her 60s. Writes for opinion outlets like in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, etc. All the establishment outlets. And this person really believes that the GOP eliminating Liz Cheney, it means we're inching closer to totalitarianism. I'm like, lady, you are the power structure. You are the authority. You are the types who are keeping political prisoners, political protesters in jail indefinitely because of their opinions. And you support that. And you think that just somebody, kicking out some person from a minor leadership role because they keep shitting on their voters, and you think that the greatest threat to our democracy is people believing that there was something suspicious about the 2020 election when there's pretty good evidence that there was something amiss there. You think that that's the threat to democracy, not your own side's behavior? But this is how the people rationalize it. The left has to always see it to themselves as the rebels. It's like how they imagine in their mythology, they love Star Wars, like we're the rebellion or we're the resistance. And they always imagine that they're fighting the evil empire, and the evil empire is apparently the party in minority power in both the House and Senate and is completely out of the White House. This is how they imagine things. And they always think that there's some creeping totalitarianism afoot within this party, this other political party that has no control over any institution. And so this is how they rationalize it. They don't imagine their own power that's happening there. And, there was a lot of people who loved Liz Cheney's speech. They're just like, oh, it's amazing that she says our democracy is stronger than ever. And America has not failed. America is stronger than before. And it's like, how the fuck can you live in this country and see the news on a daily basis and not see that America has failed in some regard? Like, oh yeah, this country is awesome. I like my kids learning about how they're evil for being white and how they should cut off their genitals and decide that they're a girl now. Yeah, this country fucking rules. And also our military imposing this vision on all its soldiers. All these advertisements. There was just a new advertisement I saw. People were complaining about the CIA woke advertisement, which I believe I talked about a little bit last week. Whereas this woman was going around saying, like, I'm a person of color and I have crippling anxiety disorder. And that empowers me. And I'm glad the CIA gives me a job. There was a new ad saying that, like, the military, it's like all LGBT values, all diversity, all animated. And it's such a joke. And it's like, you look at this and like, America's a success right now? Really? What country do you live in? And these are the people that think that, Liz Cheney still thinks it's the 1950s, even though that there's like some, transgender person serving her at McDonald's, or that, I'm not quite sure how old her kids are, but I assume they're either in high school and college, and that they're going to be learning about how they're evil for being white, and et cetera, and how America's the most evil country to ever exist. And they think like, oh, we're succeeding right now. America has not failed. And, it's like going to Detroit and all these other cities that were once great cities. Like, America has not failed. Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that. But this is the type of delusions that that the uniparty exists in, that the establishment, which, regardless of whether they're never Trumpers or whatever, they imagine that, everything's hunky dory, and that the real problem is us not being united around common principles such as anti-white racism and love for transgenders. This is what's hurting us, and we need to all come together and allow the left to rig elections against the Republican Party, and understand that that's democracy. And they'll give us a little pat on the head. They'll give us a little power here and there, but not too much. And that's democracy. And, but this is what the perception is. And the media thinks that this is the most important story, and that, like, this is a free speech issue. It's not. I've already gone over that. But it's another thing that I think they have to elevate this, not just because, it satisfies their own prejudices and biases. It's because they need Trump back for the ratings. And this is the closest thing to Trump that they have. And so they're elevating it, and they're once again, revving up their audience and making them worry about the Trump boogeyman coming back and destroying our democracy like he did in the last 4 years, which he clearly did not. This is what they think that's going to happen. So they need this for the ratings, and this is the closest thing. And they can do some pontificating and show how moral they are and how righteous they are, with the Liz Cheney story. But I mean, they did this. I mean, and treating this as a world historical event is just silly. I'm old enough, it wasn't too long ago, in 2017 and 2018, when they treated every Jeff Flake speech as something that's going to go in the history books. I think his speech announcing he was not going to run for election, his retirement speech, every single reporter who worked at MSNBC, Politico, etc., said this is going to go in the history books. They all forgot about it a week later. And I guarantee you, if you went up to any of these reporters, I think Casey Hunt was one of the worst who was like, this is one for the history books. I bet she couldn't even remember that fucking speech or anything that he said in that speech. And they're going to say the same with Liz Cheney's stupid lectures and sermons that happened today. People are going to forget about Liz Cheney. Her only hope now is that maybe she can become a contributor on CNN. I think they're even going to draw the line at that. She says, I'm going to take back the party. There's literally no base for her except outside of newsrooms and think tanks. Her own state party censored her, and her own party's booing her. And if, they got a serious primary challenger against her with Trump out there, campaigning for that person, and other top Republicans campaigning for that person, she'd be destroyed. She doesn't have that power. It's not like the people of Wyoming are just desperate for Liz Cheney. And it's another thing, but the media keeps elevating this. They've been doing this for the past 5 years, where they elevated Ev McMullen, said he would win states. He didn't win any states, and he was a extremely weird person. But yeah, they said he was actually the real popular candidate among Republicans. They elevated Jeff Flake. They've elevated various never Trumpers who were, nobody's writing columns that nobody read at National Review, and said that this person's reflective of the real Republican base. They elevated David French. They elevated all of these people, and they still do that. I mean, there is a new New York Times article where Miles Taylor, the anonymous guy who's this douchebag who always goes on to talk about how Trump is evil and a threat to our country, and he worked at DHS, once again showing the personnel problems behind the Trump administration. And they ran an article saying that 100 officials are threatening to leave the GOP unless they do everything they say. And it's like, none of these people are active officials. They're all former, they mostly have some former governors and former congressmen. Why the hell are they going to do this? But the media publishes this as a straight press release and saying, "Oh, there's a real chance of a third party." There is not a chance of a third party. They've been talking about this ever since John Anderson ran against Ronald Reagan in 1980. There's never going to be the moderate centrist third party for enlightened people. That's never going to work. It's never going to happen. And it's just a media delusion. They just love these things, but they just have a short-term memory. They don't have any, self-awareness of how they covered things, even just 3 or 4 years ago. And they'll just run with this stupid stuff. So I think that overall, Liz Cheney, she'll become a name, I guess, for a little bit. But I mean, she's just another Jeff Flake. Like, people are going to forget about her. She's going to probably, I have a feeling she's probably going to lose her seat, depending on how they run the primary challenge. I mean, if she wins, that's a setback for the Trump party, but I don't think she's going to win. They just have to find the right candidate. And if she gets kicked out, good for the Republican Party, good for the right. And that's something to keep in mind. Now moving on to another lovely subject, it's the topic of Israel. Israel is back in the news due to a recent flare-up of hostilities between them and the Palestinians. Palestinians are firing rockets in Israel, and Israel is sending airstrikes back. It's once again, I think this is the biggest flare-up since 2014. They always have these flare-ups. Some people have argued that, there was, I believe it's storming. They stormed over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I'm of course mispronouncing it, but Israel sent troops into there. That was considered an affront. Resumed hostilities. It's it's an event that happens every 5 years, but it presents an interesting barometer of how American media or how the American elite discourse considers Israel. And I've been arguing on Twitter that, and some people have disagreed, and most people, polite disagreement and some interesting rejoinders, is saying that, the mainstream left is changing on the subject of Israel. Now, the evidence I was using is Andrew Yang tweeted out, a very milquetoast endorsement of Israel. It was plain and simple. It wasn't like saying wow, we hope that you annihilate these Palestinian savages or whatever. He's just saying I stand with Israel and they're suffering terrorism. I mean, I get, yeah, largely true, whatever. And that was first off ratio. That statement had thousands and thousands of people getting angry about it. And if you saw this, there was tons of blue checks, and many of them working at prestige outlets. Even a few prominent political activists who are calling this an endorsement of white supremacy, racism, and a complete betrayal of people of color. And you're thinking, and I have a pretty good memory of what, how Israeli conflicts were covered in the 2000s and especially in 2014. And this mild statement that a Democratic politician would make, and especially in Andrew Yang is running in a city that's very Jewish, and it's clearly a political move, that would have been considered whatever, it's what he does. And the amount of outrage it contained shows how the public discourse is changing on Israel, especially on the left. And you wouldn't have seen, I remember 5 or 6 years ago, or even during the 2016 election, the Democrats were starting to get more uncomfortable about discussing Israel. I remember Chris Hayes sent out a tweet, I think it was maybe in 2016 or 2017, MSNBC host, I assume most of you know who Chris Hayes is, saying, I don't really know what to think about Israel. I just, it seems like a really heated discussion. I just don't know what to think. And it's, of course he knows what to think, but he knows that, both sides are bitterly, no matter what position you take, you're going to take a lot of flack, and he just doesn't want to take a lot of flack, and he's not sure of what to take. 10 years ago, that person Chris Hayes and his position would have had to have been unabashedly pro-Israel, because if he was anti-Israel, he would have lost his job at MSNBC. But now there is there's a side channel of MSNBC that now hosts Mehdi Hassan, who is this horrible Muslim commentator who's always talking about Black Lives Matter and intersectionality and always promoting anti-white racism and gun control. He's really arrogant too. He's one of the worst people in media. But anyway, he had his own show on Peacock, and he was talking about how Israel is this evil settler state and it's colonialist and it's oppressing these poor Palestinians. And this is a subsidiary of MSNBC. It's a part of the NBC Universal Empire, and they're hosting this host giving this speech that if he had said, 10 or 15 years ago on associated with any major network, he would have lost his job. And I think that is the case. I mean, I remember in the 2000s, like if you turned on the TV, it was basically portraying Israeli propaganda. It's like they would show like women and children in Israel being hurt, and how dare Palestinians or Lebanese do this to, or Hezbollah do this to the poor Israelis. And now it's like it's changing. And I think you're seeing a lot of politicians who are calling out using these phrases of settler state, colonialist power, white supremacy to ascribe to Israel. And I think, and you're not even seeing the Democrats like do these like full-throated endorsements of Israel either. I mean, Joe Biden hasn't said anything about the conflict, and they issued a really mealy-mouthed statement, not really showing who they stand with and saying, "Oh, we're watching the scenario." And there is this change that's, happening that, like, I think the Israeli lobby is losing a lot of its influence over the Democratic Party. This started with Obama negotiating the Iran deal. This was their number one thing that they cared about, the number one thing they opposed, and they brought their full weight of opposition towards it, and it still went through. They could not stop it. And I think that the Iran deal really marks a milestone in the relationship between the American left and Israel. I think, one thing is the American public may not be changing that much. I mean, the latest Gallup poll showed over 70% of Americans have a favorable opinion of Israel. I mean, that favorable opinion may be just like, oh yeah, I guess I like Israel. But that does show that a large percentage of Americans care about it. But at the same time, they have a greater appreciation for the PLA, which 20 years ago they would have seen as a terrorist organization. So I think it's over 30% now. So it's gaining, and it's continuing to increase over the years. So the left doesn't necessarily have, they may be alienating the American public, but I don't think the American public cares about as much as Israel as they did before. And this is especially seen among younger Jews. I mean, younger Jews who are secular, maybe not practicing, they maybe not even bar mitzvah, they don't give a shit about Israel. They don't care about it. It's not an issue that cares about them. They don't see themselves and Israelis as having anything in common. And Jewish identity is just a way of separating themselves from the white mainstream. That's basically the extent of their Jewish identity, and it makes them, a minority, and maybe if they're leftists, they see themselves as being in solidarity with fellow POC, but it doesn't make them have any solidarity or see any kinship with them between them and Israel. It's really an older Jewish population that sees this, and I think a lot of these people who have a lot of influence over the left also have this, and I think among the grassroots base of the Democratic Party, it is not controversial to be pro-Palestinian anymore. It's not controversial to want to call Israel a colonial state, a settler state, a white supremacist power. This is how they see it. And this is, they see the change can be brought about as like the BLM-ification of the left, of them seeing like everything as a war between white supremacists and oppressed POC. And when they look at the Israel conflict, they see Israelis as the white supremacists and the Palestinians as the oppressed POC. And this is all they need to know to take a side on this. And, DSA, which has had more power, endorses a basically an abolishment of Israel. And that's not a minor player. I mean, yes, it's not at the forefront of the party. I mean, and yes, Nancy Pelosi and people like that still stand with Israel. But if you look at the young leadership, and if you look at the response of the Obama or the Biden administration, even though it's really extension of the Obama administration, they're not as pro-Israeli before. And even with Biden, they're wanting to do a new Iran deal again. And they're unfreezing Iranian assets. They're looking to negotiate. They're freeing prisoners. They're doing everything possible to work with Iran, this is something strongly opposed by the Israeli lobby. So, I think the latest conflicts produce a change. And another, I think actually probably the best barometer of showing how the left has changed and the mainstream left's attitude on Israel, they may not be full-throated like we need a peace solution now that favors the Palestinians, and maybe they're not calling, all the mainstream liberals are not fully calling, the Israelis a settler state and white supremacists, but they're not necessarily defending Israel, and they're staying silent about this. And one of the points that I noticed on Twitter is that all these never-Trumper neocons like David Frum, Bill Kristol, etc., are basically not talking about Israel. They're all talking about Liz Cheney, and their big issue for most of their lives was Israel. And they're so committed to appeasing the mainstream left that they've decided to just not say anything about it. And they know mainstream liberals butter their bread. They know if they tweet out their true thoughts on Israel, they're going to alienate their base. And I think, I pointed this out with David Frum. David Frum is trying to present himself as like an impartial observer of the Israeli conflict. I'm just observing. He's like saying like, oh, it looks like Jared Kushner's peace process didn't work. And this guy in 2014 was full on bloodthirsty on Twitter. Like he was like, get after him. He was celebrating, the helicopters blowing up apartment buildings. And really what he got in trouble for was he was sharing Thomas Wichter posts. And this is before Thomas Wichter, of course, became, a meme celebrity, an accidental meme celebrity on Twitter through his hilarious defenses of Trump's and his weird conspiracy theories. He was sharing Thomas Wichter posts about how all these like dead Palestinians and bleeding Palestinians in hospitals were completely fake. And he was like, energetically sharing this stuff. And this is a guy who now just like claims like, oh yeah, I don't really care. I'm just observing right now. And he's now presenting himself as just this mild observer who's just standing with the left. If he was doing that stuff now, he'd probably lose his job at the Atlantic. And a bigger, and another example, even though Peter Beinart was never a neocon, he was always on the liberal side, he started his career as an editor at the New Republic. And the New Republic was where most of these neocons started. And back then, like, they were full-throated Zionists, like, wanted to napalm Palestinians. And he is now a firm critic of Israel who will call them white supremacists in a settler state. And he works at The Atlantic alongside David Frum. And Frum tweeted out his true thoughts. He would be alienating people like Peter Beinart and people who are maybe not too as radicalized on the Israeli issue as him, but people like him who would ultimately side more with Beinart than they would with Frum. Bill Kristol, of course, is not talking about it. He's just talking about Liz Cheney, and that's, of course, his main issue. And he, in 2014, was going crazy about the Palestinians, but now he knows he can't do that. And this is, I think that is important because these people are cynical who know when to say things to appeal to their audience. And if they think that their audience can't handle full-throated Zionism, that is a good indication that the mainstream left has changed on this issue. And these people have completely no shame or self-awareness. I mean, David Frum last week was complaining about how Tucker was a more full-throated, bloodthirsty advocate of the Iraq War than him. David Frum was one of the architects of the Iraq War. He came up with the phrase axis of evil when he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. And he wrote a famous National Review article drumming out all the paleoconservatives and libertarians who opposed the war as unpatriotic racists. And he wanted this war so more badly than anyone else. Him and the neocons engineered it, and they were more responsible for the war than Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson was just one of the many conservatives that they would have on CNN and Weekly Standard writer. Like, he didn't have the power to engineer the war, but due to their revisionism, now they can imagine themselves as like, oh, well, I was just once again, a disinterested supporter of the Iraq War. I didn't really have many strong opinions about it, even though I came up with the phrase axis of evil and was a George W. Bush speechwriter and was helping, Paul Wolfowitz and others plan for the war. But, Tucker Carlson is way more responsible for the war than me. I was just disinterested observer. But, I didn't really care about the Iraq War. This is how they see themselves. And, this is how the change they are. But getting back to the Israel issue, I don't think that Israel is going to always be able to count on, Democratic politicians to support them when the party is taken over by anti-white racism. And yes, we can argue all day over whether Israelis are white or whatever, but the important thing is that non-whites see them as white, and that's the defining standard now. And no matter what Jews say or whatever, that's how non-whites see them, and there's nothing that they can do to argue against that. A party that opposes, wants to abolish police, abolish prisons, and impose critical race theory training, which is really anti-white racism, on all schools, military, and even corporate jobs, is not going to, have the cognitive dissonance to support a state that is light-skinned. And they perceive as white, to use a brutal police power to, stay in control or keep their country in line. They're not going to square that circle. And a lot of times, the right, back in the 2010s, thinking about that, back in the 2010s, you're almost like, wait a minute, that's like yesterday. No, it's actually another decade ago. You get old, kids, thinking about that. And now, but back to the point, a lot of time in 2016, 2015, the then alt-right and internet right would love to talk about, we want open borders for Israel. And this was done to show the hypocrisy of the elite establishment, that they want open borders for America and the West, but they don't want the same policy for Israel. Now they want Israel to have the same. Now they begin to question, like, why Israel won't let blacks into their country. Why they make Arabs second-class citizens. They will openly call that an apartheid state. And it is due to this, and it's not and a lot of people on the right, of course, don't like Israel, aren't big fans of Israel, but this is not necessarily a good thing from our perspective, because this is just a larger part of their anti-white racism that dominates the left. And they're applying it now to Israel, and there's no longer going to be the hypocritical double standard. It's like, open borders for Israel? Absolutely, of course we support that. Arabs should have their, vote in the elections and have full civil rights. There's no reason Israel shouldn't be a Jewish state. That's ethno-nationalism. That's racist. They're no longer going to accept, the differences between America and Israel. Like, America cannot have an ethnic core, but Israel can. Now they believe that Israel shouldn't have an ethnic core. It shouldn't be a Jewish state. That's the changes in their perspective. And some people, I think on some of our side may like to see that as a victory, but it's a larger part of the anti-white push in our own countries. And I think in a lot of ways, you just have to, Israel question, people need to have a nuanced perspective. People don't really like nuance in politics, but I think that's actually the better position. Like, some people view, like, as long as Israel exists, like, we will never have victory. I'm not necessarily in that perspective. I think, like any nation state, it has the right to exist. I just don't think that it, or like most nation states, I should say, it has the right to exist. I just don't think they should control our foreign, or tell us what to do in foreign policy, or, drag us into wars that are not in our best interest. That's pretty much my perspective on this. But at the same time, when it looks to Palestinians and Israelis, I'm just like, whatever, that's their issue. We shouldn't concern ourselves with the peace. If they want to come to a peace process, they can come to a peace process. But, we've got more important things to worry about. But at this time, I think there will be a day where the left goes to the point where they're forcing Israel to, they no longer can build settlements. Like, they will actually put sanctions on them. I think there will come a time where, it's not going to necessarily, there's definitely going to be more pushback and opposition towards this than what happened with South Africa. But I think being treated as South Africa, it's not an unrealistic likelihood. And I think within the next 4 or so years, you're going to see a serious movement to place sanctions on Israel to punish Israel for how they treat Palestinians. Now Israel, we still may use our foreign policy to benefit Israel, but we're also at the same time going to use our power to ensure that Israel is no longer a Jewish state. I think that's going to be an interesting turnaround that happens, but I think that's what we're going to see now. that yeah, you'll still have people like Andrew Yang, and the other leading candidate in the New York City Democratic primaries also issued a mild pro-Israel statement. Like they'll still win and they'll still go to victory, but I think that their time is running out on the Democrats. Now it's a completely different standard on the American right. A lot of people in my mentions were saying, "Well, I hope the right is undergoing the same change." Not so. It's almost the opposite direction. Is the right is becoming more fervently Zionist than any time. I don't think you could have even people like Ron Paul exist in the Republican Party anymore by being anti-Israel. And even every good politician that we like, and people always want to complain about Trump. Oh, he's a Zionist. He's an anti-Israel. All the other alternatives, especially Ron DeSantis, are equally Zionist or pro-Zionist and pro-Israel. So there's not really an alternative within the GOP. And I think among ordinary Republicans, like there's not necessarily a constituency for anti-Zionism. This may stand as a black pill for a lot of people, but that's just the fact of nature is that there's no, and even in the European right, I mean, the European right is becoming more powerful by ditching a lot of their old anti-Zionism and like saying like Israel has a right to exist. I mean, they're much more mild about it than the people here in America who worship Israel and think it's their greatest ally. They simply just say Israel has a right to exist, and that's a reaction to the left, who for a longer time the left in Europe has been much more fervently anti-Zionist and seen them as an ethno-nationalist, white supremacist state. And it's almost an opposition to that. It's like saying, like, well, us as French have the same right to exist as the Israelis do, and to have the right to our country. And France should be a French country in the same way that Israel should be a Jewish state. And that's their reasoning behind that. So you see people like Salvini, Orban. I think the AfD is also pro-Israel. Several other, and definitely the Swedish Democrats, and pretty much every other mainstream, nationalist party is. Fairly pro-Israel. I mean, it's not like it's not like some of the Republicans, though. But I think I think this is something, a perspective to keep in mind, is that a lot of people want to make their whole political ideology about anti-Israel and stuff. But I mean, you're essentially keeping yourself, you're handicapping yourself, and you're alienating yourself from the people we're trying to reach. Not necessarily saying that we should be pro-Israel or rah rah rah, raise the flag. It's like that's not my thing. I think that's most of our listeners' thing, but I think it does need a more nuanced position on Israel and understanding of the future has. I think, but it also is a give and take. If you're going to say, well, I stand with Israel, then like a lot of these Zionists in America and Israel need to stop, dictating our foreign policy. They need to they need to realize that we're not a country to serve them. We're, we're its patron. They need to get its priorities straight. And I think a lot of these, Zionist conservatives need to realize that we want the same things that Israel has. We want closed borders. We want a state that's for Americans. The real Americans, the real Native Americans, not just for the whole world to come here. We want a lot of the same things that Israel has. We want a border wall. And I think they need to end the cognitive dissonance they have where they want open borders for America, but closed borders for Israel. And, that has to be the trade-off if there's going to be any type of like support for Israel. But I think the best perspective is like, when these conflicts happen, is to sit back and say, not our problem, and it's not our problem, but it is interesting to note how the left is changing due to the BLM-ification of the left and the Democratic Party. And a party that stands for anti-white racism here is not going to stand for Israel in the Middle East. And, that's my perspective on it. I think some people are probably going to disagree with that. I could imagine there's going to be some angry commenters, because no matter what you say on Israel, people get pissed off. So it's one of the problems of running into the minefield. But with that, we're now going to move on to our favorite Patreon questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me or a guest questions and even suggest guests or topics on Highly Respected if you sign up for the Patreon option at Highly Respected's Patreon. This one comes from Tony. He asks, Scott, why are all these leftists so mad at you about John Brown? Why do they love John Brown so much? This is a great question. as was happening earlier this week, for some reason I said, I just say things. I express new ideas on Twitter, and people get really mad. But they got very mad that, there was, I think it was John Brown's birthday or the anniversary of his hanging, and all these people were celebrating John Brown. And I simply said he's a terrorist and a nut job, both true. And that Robert E. Lee is more worthy of veneration, also true. And people got so mad. There was even some mainstream liberals who were mad. He's like, oh, you stand up for a loser and a failure by standing up for Robert E. Lee. And yeah, it's like, oh yeah, you working some slug, fat, loser, unmarried, no kids, working some boring 9-to-5 job. Yeah, you're much better than one of the greatest generals America has ever produced. And any of these people say like Robert E. Lee is a loser or a failure, you could say the same about Hannibal. He didn't win his war. Pompey, he didn't win against Julius Caesar. Napoleon, he eventually didn't win his war. And many others, and even Irvin Rommel and people like that, even though they may want to say Irvin Rommel is now a loser too. Just because he eventually lost the war due to circumstances he couldn't necessarily control doesn't mean he's a terrible general. And, he defeated generals of, armies much mightier than his, much larger than his, with superior tactics. So I don't know how you can claim Lee is a terrible general, but they want to deny all the villains of history any positive attributes. They have to be the worst people possible and total losers and failures, unlike the people who have to take massive amounts of SSRIs just to survive throughout the day. So these people get very mad, but they look to John Brown because the American left doesn't have many heroes to look through for in American history. So they basically just support, like any person who killed whites that they hate. And that's why they like John Brown. They like this idea of terrorists, and they like this, even of course, like they wouldn't share. The reason why John Brown was a maniac is that he was like a religious zealot who thought that God was telling him to kill slave owners. This is like a Jim Jones type who's leading his weird cult around. And of course, none of these people believe in God or anything of higher order. And, this would be, in some ways, John Brown, if, people were like claiming God told me to do something, the leftists would scream and bloody murder about it if they were doing today. It's like the same. It's like these people, if somebody said God told them to blow up an abortion clinic, these same people would want the death penalty against them. So, it's not a consistent standard. But they like him because they can impose their own ideology on John Brown. And they also do this to other figures who clearly had a complete opposite of the left's ideology, such as William Tecumseh Sherman, the great Union general who burnt Georgia and South Carolina to the ground. This was Sherman, despite his brutality against the South, was a racist himself who thought that blacks were inferior to whites, who wanted to exterminate all Indians. He said in his policy that the more Indians we kill this year, the less we have to kill next year. He was not at all a leftist, and he in many ways sympathized with the South's plight. He opposed, strict Reconstruction. He felt that it was giving power to blacks over whites in the South, and he thought that was a terrible idea. He shared nothing in common with the left of today, but they think they want to impose him their DSA vision on Sherman. So he becomes DSA Sherman, which is completely disconnected from actual history. So they don't have many historical figures to harp on and love. But yeah, and John Brown just becomes like this, like a mindset for them. Is like there's always been, left-wing groups named after John Brown. And, it has this way of tolerable violence that they like, and they like to, LARP as these terrorists, guerrillas, etc. And mainstream society allows this, them saying that John Brown was cool to kill slavers, that opinion is shared by every university, every elementary school textbook, every corporation, every politician, etc. It's not a rebellious position, but it gives them the ability to feel like they're saying something threatening and something edgy by saying like, I identify with John Brown, and like, yeah, it's good that he killed slavers or people, white Southerners, which in the end he really just killed. In Kansas, he killed 5 defenseless men and butchered them. And when he took over Harper's Ferry, he only killed 3 blacks. So he wasn't necessarily, very successful in what they love him for. So they love these figures. But John Brown, it is worth shilling against, and some people don't want to because they're like, oh, but he opposed slavery. Well, a lot of people oppose slavery, but I mean, the general thrust of the anti-white racism that we're experiencing in education comes from this idea that slavery is a unique sin to America, and there's nothing we can do to ever repay for it, when slavery has been a part of every civilization and every group from the beginning of time, and America is no different. And the difference is that America, over 600,000 Americans, pretty much vast majority of them white. I think it's like 90% I think it's actually like 95% of them white, died to end it. And that's what makes us different from other groups and cultures, is that we had a war over. But, saying this idea that like, oh, you have a license to kill slave owners, that's like, and like many of these people are going to admire like Greece, Rome, and some of these people even there was a guy who had like Xerxes as his name, and it's like Persia Empire was a giant slave empire, and they're like, oh no, they didn't have slavery. Yeah, they did. But there are people who make these excuses like, oh, slavery was much better in Rome. Yeah, I don't think the slaves working the mines had a very high survival rate, but they'll still claim this. So I think, by accepting that, narrative like, oh, well, slavery was bad and these people were engaged in a bad thing, you allow them to interject this idea that we Americans, white Americans especially, suffer from this unique sin that no other people and no other culture suffer from or share, and that we must pay penance to these lowly, innocent POC in order to overcome ourselves. We have to do everything possible for magic Americans to ensure that we pay our debt for slavery. And I think we really need to eliminate that and just say slavery is a part of every human civilization. As it is practiced in America, compared with Brazil and some of these Latin American countries, as academics disputed and later found out in the 60s and 70s, the slavery was much worse than in Brazil, and various other places throughout the world. We ended it. We moved on from it, and it shouldn't allow us to, grovel and to beg apology from people. And that's the correct notion from it. And it shouldn't allow us to honor terrorists and nut jobs like John Brown. So those are my concluding thoughts for today. We may start an exciting project next week for Highly Respected that may give listeners an opportunity to listen to more episodes. May start next week, may take later, but I think we're going to start next week, but I'll keep you posted on that. But until next time, stay respected.